Just wanted to say thank you and welcome to the new subscribers. I had no idea that one of my videos would get so much attention. I started doing these stories because I like listening to the Dark Somnium and his tales. They inspired me to make some in similar style. Again, thanks for subscribing and listening. I'll start uploading more stories from now on, starting with this one. It will be part of a series that I think I'm going to do based on park rangers that work in each state. Starting with Florida, since it's my home state. Hope you all enjoy. Ranger Mike Callahan wiped the sweat from his brow, cursing the oppressive Florida heat. The cicada's incessant drone filled the air, a monotonous backdrop to the eerie stillness of Big Cypress National Preserve. He'd been a ranger here for over a decade, but something about today felt off. Dispatch to Ranger Callahan, come in. Mike unclipped the radio from his belt. Callahan here. Go ahead, dispatch. We've got another report. Campers at Site 17 saying they heard strange noises last night. Also mentioned a foul smell. Mike sighed. It was the third such report this week, and copy that. I'm on my way. As he navigated his SUV down the winding park road, Mike's mind wandered to the recent uptick in bizarre occurrences. Visitors reporting unearthly howls echoing through the swamp at night. The putrid stench that seemed to linger in certain areas, described as a mix of rotten eggs and wet dog. And then there were the footprints. Massive humanoid tracks that couldn't be explained away as belonging to any known Florida wildlife. The locals had a name for the creature they believed was responsible. The Skunk Ape. A Florida Bigfoot, they said, known for its pungent odor and elusive nature. Mike had always dismissed it as nonsense, a tall tale to scare tourists and sell t-shirts in tacky gift shops, but lately a seed of doubt had taken root in his mind. He pulled up to campsite 17, where a middle-aged couple stood waiting. The woman wrung her hands nervously, while her husband paced back and forth. "Folks, I'm Ranger Callahan. What seems to be the problem?" The woman spoke first, her voice trembling. It was horrible, just horrible. The noises, and I've never heard anything like it in my life. Her husband nodded vigorously. Started around midnight. Sounded like, I don't know, a cross between a howler monkey and a bear, but angrier, more human somehow. Mike jotted notes in his pad. And the smell? The man's face contorted in disgust. Like something crawled out of a sewer and died. Hit us out of nowhere, so strong it woke us up. Thought maybe a skunk had sprayed nearby, but this was way worse. Did you see anything, Mike? Mike. Susada's Sini. They shook their heads, too scared to leave the tent. The woman admitted. But this morning we found, well, you should probably see for yourself. They led Mike to the edge of their campsite, where the manicured ground gave way to the wild tangle of the swamp. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a footprint unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was huge, easily twice the size of his own boot, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The track was deep, suggesting incredible weight behind it. Mike felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat. He'd seen photos of alleged skunk ape prints before, but always assumed they were hoaxes. Seeing one in person, mere hours old, was an entirely different experience. "We're cutting our trip short," the husband said, already packing up their gear. "Don't feel safe here anymore." Mike nodded absently, his eyes still fixed on the print. "I understand. We'll look into this. I promise." After the couple left, Mike spent another hour combing the area for signs of the creature. He found 2 more prints, along with some broken branches high up in the trees, far too high for a human to reach. As he worked, the feeling of being watched prickled at the back of his neck. Twice he spun around, certain he'd catch a glimpse of something lurking in the underbrush, but there was nothing there, nothing he could see at least. Back at Ranger headquarters, Mike pored over a map of Big Cypress, marking the locations of recent sightings and strange occurrences. A pattern was emerging, centered around the most remote and treacherous part of the preserve, an area the locals call the Devil's Garden. You're not buying into this skunk ape nonsense, are you? Mike looked up to see his colleague Sarah leaning against the doorframe. She nodded at the map, an eyebrow raised skeptically. "No, I don't know what to believe anymore," Mike admitted, "but something strange is going on out there. You can't deny that." Sarah shrugged. "People come to the swamp expecting to be scared. Their imaginations run wild. Doesn't mean there's actually a monster out there." "What about the missing family?" Mike countered, "and the Harrises? They vanished without a trace 3 days ago. Their campsite was right in the middle of all this activity." "Could be gators," Sarah suggested. Mike shook his head. "Their car was still there. All their gear left behind. It doesn't add up." Sarah's expression softened. "Look, I know you feel responsible, but don't go chasing shadows, Mike. Whatever happened to the Harrises, I doubt it has anything to do with some mythical swamp beast." After she left, Mike stared at the map, tracing the pattern of sightings with his finger. Sarah was probably right. He was letting his imagination get the better of him. And yet, he made his decision. Tomorrow he'd venture into the Devil's Garden. He had to see for himself, to put these ridiculous theories to rest once and for all. Little did Mike know, he was about to stumble into a nightmare beyond his wildest imagination. The next morning dawned gray and humid, a fine mist clinging to the cypress trees. Mike loaded up his pack with supplies for a 3-day excursion: water, rations, first aid kit, GPS, satellite phone. He holstered his sidearm, hoping he wouldn't need it, but unwilling to take chances. As he prepared to leave, Sarah caught him in the parking lot. "You're really going through with this?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Mike nodded. "I have to, Sarah. If there's even a chance the Harrises are still out there." She sighed, then surprised him by pulling him into a quick hug. "Just be careful, okay? That swamp doesn't forgive mistakes." The first few hours of Mike's trek were uneventful. He pushed deeper into the preserve, following game trails and old logging roads. The constant buzz of insects, an occasional splash of a startled gator were his only companions. As the day wore on, the swamp grew denser, the light dimming as the canopy closed in overhead. It was late afternoon when Mike first noticed the smell, a rancid, musky odor that made his eyes water and his stomach churn. He pulled his shirt up over his nose, but it did little to block the stench. This had to be what the campers were talking about, the signature scent of the skunk ape. Pushing through a curtain of Spanish moss, Mike froze. There, not 20 feet away, stood a massive black bear. It reared up on its hind legs, easily 8 feet tall. For a heart-stopping moment, Mike was certain he was about to be attacked. But the bear's attention wasn't on him. It was staring intently into the brush to its right, hackles raised. A low, rumbling growl emanated from the undergrowth. It was unlike anything Mike had ever heard. Not quite animal, not quite human. The bear's eyes went wide with what could only be described as terror. It dropped to all fours and lumbered away as fast as its bulk would allow, crashing through the swamp in its haste to escape. Mike's hand went to his holster, heart pounding. What could possibly frighten a full-grown black bear like that? He held his breath, straining to hear any sign of movement from the direction of the growl. But there was only silence. An unnatural, heavy silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. After what felt like an eternity, Mike forced himself to move. His hand shook as he checked his GPS, plotting a course deeper into the Devil's Garden. He tried to convince himself that there was a rational explanation for what he'd just witnessed. Maybe it was some kind of territorial dispute between the bear and another predator. A panther, perhaps. But deep down, Mike knew he was only deluding himself. Whatever had made that sound, whatever had terrified that bear, was something unknown to science, something that, up until today, he would have sworn couldn't possibly exist. As darkness fell, Mike made camp in a small clearing. He didn't dare light a fire, not wanting to draw attention to himself. He choked down a cold meal of trail mix and jerky, then settled in for what he knew would be a long, sleepless night. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set Mike on edge. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the ever-present tangle of vegetation. The smell came and went, sometimes so faint he thought he might be imagining it, other times so strong it made him gag. It was nearing midnight when Mike heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold, a child's voice calling out in the distance. "Mommy, Daddy, where are you?" Mike sat bolt upright, fumbling for his flashlight. It had to be Emily Harris, the missing 10-year-old. But how could she have survived out here for days on her own? "Hello," Mike called out. "This is Ranger Callahan. I'm here to help." Silence. Then, from much closer, "Help me. Please. I'm scared." Mike was on his feet in an instant, all thoughts of caution forgotten. He crashed through the underbrush, following the sound of Emily's voice. She sounded so close, just beyond the next stand of trees. He burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt. There in the center stood a crude structure made of sticks and mud. It looked almost like a child's approximation of a house. And hanging from one of the walls was a dirty pink backpack, the same one Emily Harris had been carrying when she disappeared. "Oh God," Mike whispered, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. This was no natural phenomenon. This was evidence of intelligence, of planning. Whatever was out here, it was smart enough to build shelter, smart enough to use bait to lure in its prey. The realization came a moment too late. Something huge and impossibly fast burst from the shadows behind him. Mike caught a glimpse of matted fur, of long arms ending in wickedly curved claws. Then pain exploded across his back as those claws raked through his shirt and into flesh. Mike's training kicked in. He rolled with the impact, coming up in a crouch with his gun drawn. But the creature was already gone, melting back into the darkness with preternatural speed. Breathing hard, Mike backed up until he felt the rough bark of a tree against his shoulders. Blood trickled down his back, warm and sticky. He swept his flashlight in a wide arc, searching desperately for any sign of movement. "I know you're out there," he called, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "What do you want?" A low chuckle drifted through the trees, so human-like it made Mike's skin crawl. Then a voice, deep and guttural, but unmistakably forming words. To hunt. Mike's mind reeled. The creature could speak. It wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It was something far more terrifying. Something that blurred the line between man and beast. He needed to get out of there, to radio for backup. But as he fumbled for his satellite phone, a sicking realization dawned on him. It was gone, likely torn from his belt during the attack. Without it, he was truly alone out here. A twig snapped to his left. Mike spun, firing 2 shots into the darkness. The gunshots echoed through the swamp, startlingly loud in the oppressive silence that followed. Had he hit it, or just angered it further? His question was answered moments later when something heavy slammed into him from behind, sending him sprawling face first into the muck. His gun flew from his grasp, disappearing into the undergrowth. Panic threatened to overwhelm him as he scrambled to his feet, but years of training kept him focused. Mike ran. He ran like he'd never run before, crashing through vines and branches, uncurring of the scratches that bloomed across his skin. Behind him, he could hear the creature in pursuit. It moved with terrifying speed, effortlessly keeping pace despite Mike's desperate flight. And just when he thought his lungs would burst, Mike burst out of the tree line and found himself on the edge of a vast expanse of sawgrass. The moon peeked out from behind the clouds, casting a silvery glow across the landscape. In the distance, he could see the silhouette of an old hunting blind perched on stilts above the grass. It was his only chance. Mike plunged into the sawgrass, the razor-sharp blade slicing at his arms and legs as he fought his way through. The blind seemed impossibly far away, but he pushed on, driven by sheer terror. Behind him, the creature let out a bone-chilling roar. It was close. too close. Mike could hear it thrashing through the grass, gaining on him with every step. His foot caught on a submerged root, and he went down hard, face plunging beneath the surface of the shallow water. For a moment, Mike was certain it was over, but as he struggled to his feet, spitting out fetid water, his hand closed around something solid. A piece of driftwood, worn smooth by the elements. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Mike whirled around, brandishing his makeshift weapon. The creature loomed over him, a mass of matted fur and rippling muscle. In the moonlight, he could finally see it clearly. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with a face that was a nightmarish blend of ape and man. Its eyes gleamed with a terrible intelligence. "Stay back," Mike shouted, swinging the driftwood in a wide arc. The skunk ape, for what else could it be, tilted its head regarding Mike with what almost looked like amusement. Then it spoke again, its voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in Mike's chest.
"Brave human. Stupid, but brave."
Without warning, it lashed out with one massive arm. Mike barely managed to bring the driftwood up in time. The impact shattered the wood and sent him stumbling backward. He lost his footing in the muddy water, going down hard. The creature was on him in an instant, its foul breath hot on Mike's face. This was it. He was going to die here, torn apart by a monster he'd never even believed in until today. But death didn't come. Instead, the skunk ape grabbed Mike by the front of his shirt and hauled him to his feet with terrifying ease. It leaned in close, studying him intently.
"Run!"
it growled.
"Run far. Run fast. Make it fun."
Then it shoved Mike away with such force that he flew several feet before crashing back into the sawgrass. He scrambled to his feet, chest heaving. The creature stood motionless, watching him. Mike didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, pushing through the grass with renewed desperation. This time, he didn't hear pursuit, but that was almost worse. He knew the thing was out there, watching, waiting, playing with its food. By the time Mike reached the hunting blind, his legs were trembling with exhaustion. He hauled himself up the rickety ladder, collapsing onto the rough wooden floor. For several minutes, he simply lay there, gulping in great lungfuls of air. When he finally found the strength to sit up, Mike took stock of his situation. He was alive, but for how long? He had no weapon, no phone, no way to call for help. His pack with its supplies was long gone, lost somewhere in the swamp during his frenzied flight. The blind offered some protection, but Mike harbored no illusions. If the creature wanted in, those flimsy wooden walls wouldn't stop it. Still, it was better than being exposed on the ground. He peered out through one of the narrow windows, scanning the sea of sawgrass for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the gentle swaying of the grass in the night breeze. But Mike knew better than to let his guard down. The skunk ape was out there, watching, waiting. This was all part of its sick game. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain from Mike's various injuries made itself known. His back throbbed where the creature's claws had raked him, and 100 smaller cuts stung from his mad dash through the swamp. He did his best to clean the wounds with the stagnant water from his canteen, knowing infection could be just as deadly as the monster hunting him. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every snapping twig, every rustle of vegetation had Mike on high alert. Twice he caught glimpses of something large moving at the edge of the sawgrass, but it never came closer. It was toying with him, he realized, keeping him on edge, wearing him down psychologically as much as physically. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Mike allowed himself a glimmer of hope. He'd survived the night. Maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to civilization. The skunk ape seemed to prefer the cover of darkness. Perhaps the light of day would give Mike the advantage he needed. Cautiously, he descended from the blind. His muscles protested, stiff from hours of tension and inactivity. Mike oriented himself using the rising sun, picking a direction he hoped would lead him back towards the main part of the preserve. He'd barely gone 100 yards when he saw it, a scrap of bright yellow fabric snagged on a low-hanging branch. With trembling hands, Mike retrieved it. He recognized it immediately. It was from the shirt Emily Harris had been wearing when she disappeared. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. In his terror, he'd completely forgotten about the missing family. Were they still alive out here somewhere? Or had they already fallen victim to the monster that now hunted him? Mike's ranger training warred with his instinct for self-preservation. He knew he should keep moving, try to get himself to safety. But could he live with himself if he abandoned the Harrises to their fate? His decision was made for him when a child's scream pierced the air, coming from somewhere to the east. Without hesitation, Mike plunged back into the swamp, all thoughts of his own safety forgotten. He had a job to do, a family to save, even if it cost him his life. As Mike pushed deeper into the tangle of vegetation, the swamp seemed to come alive around him. Birds took flight in startled flocks. The ever-present hum of insects rose to a fevered pitch. It was as if the very ecosystem was reacting to some unseen threat. The screams had stopped, but Mike pressed on, following his instincts. The trees grew denser, their gnarled roots creating a treacherous maze. More than once, Mike nearly lost his footing on the slick, moss-covered ground. He was so focused on watching his step that he almost missed it, a flash of unnatural color amidst the green and brown of the swamp. Mike froze, his breath catching in his throat. There, half hidden by a curtain of Spanish moss, was a child's sneaker. Emily's sneaker. With shaking hands, Mike pushed aside the moss. What he saw made his blood run cold. A crude shelter, similar to the one he'd encountered the night before, loomed before him. But this one was larger, more elaborate, and strewn around it were items that could only have belonged to the Harris family. A man's watch, a woman's purse, a child's stuffed animal, matted with mud, and what looked horribly like blood. "Oh God," Mike whispered, bile rising in his throat. He'd been so focused on his own survival, he'd wasted precious time. Time the Harrises didn't have. A low growl emanated from the shelter. Mike stumbled backward, his hand going instinctively to where his gun should have been, but he was unarmed, defenseless against whatever horror awaited him. The growl grew louder, and something began to emerge from the crude dwelling. But it wasn't the skunk ape. It was a man, or what was left of a man. Mr. Harris crawled on all fours, his movements jerky and unnatural. His clothes hung in tatters, revealing skin mottled with an angry red rash. But it was his face that truly terrified Mike. Harris's eyes were wild, unfocused, and his mouth, dear God, his mouth was stretched in a rictus grin, lips peeled back to reveal teeth that seemed sharper, more animalistic than they should be. "Mr. Harris," Mike called out cautiously, "it's Ranger Callahan. I'm here to help." Harris's head snapped towards Mike, nostrils flaring. He let out a sound that was part growl, part strangled laugh. Then he charged. Mike barely had time to react. He dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as Harris barreled past him. The transformed man crashed into a tree, momentarily stunned, but he recovered quickly, whirling around to face Mike again. "What happened to you?" Mike asked, desperately trying to keep Harris's attention, while he looked for a way out. "Where's your family?" At the mention of family, something flickered in Harris's crazed eyes. For just a moment, a spark of recognition, of anguish. Then it was gone, subsumed once more by bestial rage. Harris charged again. This time Mike wasn't quite fast enough. Clawed fingers, and when had his nails grown so long and sharp, raked across Mike's arm, drawing blood. They grappled, crashing through the underbrush. Mike was stronger, his ranger training giving him an edge. But Harris fought with the frenzied strength of a wild animal. As they struggled, Mike caught glimpses of things in the woods around them. Dark shapes flitting between the trees, glowing eyes watching from the shadows, and always that overwhelming, musky stench. With a surge of desperate strength, Mike managed to throw Harris off. The transformed man hit a tree hard, slumping to the ground. For a moment, Mike thought the fight was over. But then Harris began to change, and it started with his bones. Mike watched in horror as Harris's joints popped and cracked, rearranging themselves into impossible new configurations. Coarse hair sprouted from his skin, spreading rapidly until his entire body was covered in a thick pelt. His face elongated, nose and mouth fusing into a bestial snout. Where Mr. Harris had been, there now crouched a creature straight out of nightmare. A hybrid of man and beast that could not exist. It raised its head and let out a howl that shook Mike to his very core. The woods erupted into chaos. More howls answered, coming from all directions. Dark shapes converged on their location, moving with terrifying speed. Mike ran. It was all he could do. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled, the sounds of pursuit nipping at his heels. He burst out of the tree line and found himself on the bank of a wide, slow-moving river. Without hesitation, Mike plunged in. The cool water was a shock to his system, but he forced himself to keep moving, swimming with powerful strokes towards the far shore. Behind him, he could hear splashing. They were following him into the water. Mike's arms and legs felt like lead, but terror gave him strength. He couldn't afford to slow down, couldn't risk a glance backward. Every second counted. Just as his strength was about to give out, Mike's feet touched the muddy bottom. He staggered onto the opposite bank, chest heaving. Only then did he dare to look back. What he saw defied explanation. A dozen or more creatures similar to what Harris had become stood at the water's edge. Behind them loomed a massive shape, the original Skunk Ape, towering over its transformed kin. They watched Mike with gleaming eyes but made no move to cross the river. The Skunk Ape raised one massive arm, pointing directly at Mike. Its voice carried clearly across the water.
You special, come back. Join us.
Mike stumbled backward, shaking his head. Never, he gasped out. The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile.
You will. The change comes. You cannot stop it.
With that, the Skunk Ape turned and lumbered back into the forest. Its followers hesitated for a moment, then melted away into the shadows. Mike sank to his knees, the weight of everything he'd seen threatening to crush him. The Harrises transformed into monsters. The Skunk Ape, far more intelligent and dangerous than anyone had imagined. And its chilling words. He looked down at his arm, where Harris had scratched him. The wound was an angry red, the skin around it already taking on a mottled appearance. A creeping numbness spread from the site, accompanied by an itching sensation that seemed to reach down to his very bones. No, Mike whispered. Oh God, no. But even as denial formed on his lips, he could feel it beginning. The change the Skunk Ape had promised. Mike threw back his head and screamed, a sound that started human but ended in a bestial howl. The hunt was over. A new phase was just beginning. The sun had barely risen when Sarah's radio crackled to life. Dispatch to all units. We've got a situation. Sarah snatched up the radio, her heart racing. This is Ranger Cooper. What's going on? Multiple reports of strange noises and sightings near the Devil's Garden last night. And Ranger Callahan missed his scheduled check-in. Sarah's blood ran cold. Mike had been out there for 2 days now, chasing his ridiculous Skunk Ape theory. She'd dismissed his concerns, but now... I'm heading out there, she said, already grabbing her gear. Send backup. The drive to the edge of the Devil's Garden was tense, Sarah's mind conjuring increasingly horrific scenarios. Had Mike fallen? Been attacked by an animal? Or was it something worse? She parked where the road ended and continued, on foot, following the coordinates of Mike's last known location. The swamp was unnaturally quiet, devoid of the usual cacophony of bird calls and insect buzzing. It set Sarah's teeth on edge. After an hour of hiking, she found Mike's abandoned campsite. His tent was shredded, supplies scattered everywhere, and the smell, like rotting meat and something musky, alien. Sarah fought the urge to gag. "Mike!" she called out, her voice echoing through the trees. "Mike! Are you out here?" A twig snapped behind her. Sarah whirled, hand going to her sidearm. "Mike, is that you?" A low growl was her only answer. Then something huge burst from the underbrush. Sarah caught a glimpse of matted fur and gleaming teeth before instinct took over. She fired 2 shots in rapid succession, then turned and ran. She crashed through the swamp, heart pounding in her ears. Whatever was chasing her, it wasn't human, and it was fast. Too fast. Sarah could hear it gaining on her with every step. Just as she thought it was over, a hand grabbed her arm and yanked her sideways. She found herself pulled into a small cave hidden behind a curtain of vines. A hand clamped over her mouth, stifling her scream. "Shh!" a familiar voice hissed. "It's me. Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized Mike, but he looked terrible, clothes torn, covered in mud and blood, and his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. They huddled in silence as the creature outside snuffled around the cave entrance. After what felt like an eternity, they heard it move off, its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. "Mike," Sarah whispered. "What the hell is going on? What was that thing?" Mike's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. That was Mr. Harris, or what's left of him." Sarah stared at him, uncomprehending. "What are you talking about? Mr. Harris is missing, along with his family." "They're not missing anymore," Mike said grimly. "They've been changed, transformed, and I'm next." He held out his arm, revealing the infected scratch. The skin around it was discolored, and Sarah could see that the veins beneath were turning black. "Oh my God," she breathed. "We need to get you to a hospital." Mike shook his head. "It's too late for that. Listen, Sarah, you need to get out of here. Tell them to quarantine this whole area. Nobody comes in or out. It's the only way to contain it." "Contain what exactly?" Sarah demanded. "Mike, you're not making any sense." "The skunk ape," Mike said. "It's real, but it's not just some undiscovered animal. It's something else. Something that can infect humans, turn them into monsters." Sarah wanted to argue, to tell Mike he was delirious, but she'd seen that thing with her own eyes. And now, looking at Mike's rapidly deteriorating condition, she couldn't deny the truth of his words. "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. Mike's eyes softened for a moment, achingly human. Then he doubled over with a groan of pain. "You have to," he gasped. "I can feel it. The change. It's starting. You need to go. Now." As if to emphasize his point, a chorus of howls erupted from the swamp around them. They were being surrounded. Sarah made a split-second decision. She pulled out her satellite phone and pressed it into Mike's hands. "Here, if you can, call for help. I'll lead them away. Buy you some time." Before Mike could protest, Sarah darted out of the cave. She fired her gun into the air, shouting to draw attention to herself. It worked. She could hear the creatures crashing through the underbrush, following her. Sarah ran like she'd never run before, zigzagging through the swamp. She had to get to her vehicle to warn the outside world of the threat lurking in Big Cypress. Behind her, the howls grew closer. Just when she thought her lungs would burst, Sarah broke through the tree line. Her SUV sat where she'd left it, a beacon of hope. She fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. A heavy weight slammed into her from behind, sending Sarah sprawling. She rolled, coming face to face with what had once been Mrs. Harris. The woman's features were twisted, halfway between human and beast. Sarah's gun had been knocked from her grasp as Mrs. Harris lunged for her throat. Sarah's hand closed around a fallen branch. She swung with all her might, catching her attacker in the temple. Mrs. Harris went down hard. Not wasting a second, Sarah scrambled to her feet and dove into the SUV. The engine roared to life just as more creatures emerged from the swamp. Sarah floored it, tires spinning in the mud before finding purchase. As she sped away, Sarah glanced in her rearview mirror. The creatures had stopped at the edge of the road, watching her go. And there, in the back of the pack, she saw a figure that made her heart stop. It was Mike, but not Mike as she'd known him. This Mike stood 8 feet tall, covered in coarse hair. Only his eyes remained recognizable, filled with a terrible mixture of hunger and anguish. Sarah forced herself to look away, pressing harder on the accelerator. She had a job to do. She had to warn everyone, to make sure no one else fell victim to the horror she'd witnessed. As she drove, Sarah's mind raced. How far had the infection spread? Was it contained to the swamp, or had it already reached populated areas? And most terrifying of all, was there any way to stop it? One thing was certain, the legend of the skunk ape would never be the same. The truth was far more terrifying than any campfire story could have imagined, and Sarah feared that this was only the beginning of a nightmare that threatened to engulf not just Big Cypress, but the entire world. Miles behind her, deep in the heart of the Devil's Garden, a chorus of inhuman howls rose into the night sky. The hunt was on, and humanity was the prey. Sarah's tires screeched as she pulled into the ranger station parking lot. She barely remembered the drive. her mind still reeling from the horrors she'd witnessed in the swamp. As she stumbled out of the vehicle, her colleague, Tom, came running. "Sarah, what happened out there? You look like hell." She grabbed his arm, her eyes wild. "We need to lock down the preserve. Now. Call everyone. Police, CDC, military, whatever it takes." Tom's brow furrowed in confusion. "Slow down. What are you talking about?" "There's no time," Sarah snapped. "Just do it." Inside the station, Sarah's frantic call to the authorities was met with skepticism. Words like quarantine and infection raised alarm bells, but her story of monsters in the swamp was a harder sell. It wasn't until she mentioned the missing Harris family that they started to take her seriously. Within hours, a joint task force of CDC officials and military personnel descended on Big Cypress. Sarah found herself recounting her story again and again, each telling making it feel more surreal. Dr. Elena Reyes, the lead CDC investigator, listened intently to Sarah's account. "And you're certain Ranger Callahan was infected?" Sarah nodded, fighting back tears. "I saw him change with my own eyes. He wasn't human anymore." Dr. Reyes's expression was grim. "We need to contain this fast. If what you're saying is true, we could be looking at a potential pandemic unlike anything we've ever seen." As night fell, the preserve was transformed into a militarized zone. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Their searchlights cutting through the darkness, armed soldiers patrolled the perimeter, under strict orders to let nothing in or out. Sarah stood at the edge of the staging area, staring out into the swamp. Somewhere out there, Mike was running with the monsters he'd once hunted. The thought made her sick to her stomach. A commotion near the command tent drew her attention. One of the search teams had returned, and they'd brought something with them. Sarah pushed her way through the crowd, her heart in her throat. On a stretcher lay a creature that defied description. It was vaguely humanoid, but covered in thick, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. And the smell, that same musky, rotting stench she'd encountered in the swamp. "Is it alive?" someone whispered. As if in answer, the creature's eyes snapped open. It let out an ear-splitting shriek and began to thrash against its restraints. Several soldiers raised their weapons, but Dr. Reyes shouted for them to hold their fire. "We need it alive," she ordered. "Sedate it now." As the medical team rushed to subdue the creature, Sarah caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. Around the thing's neck was a tattered piece of cloth, the remains of a park ranger uniform. "Oh, Mike," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What have you become?" The next few days passed in a blur of activity. More creatures were captured, some alive, others dead. Each new specimen seemed to be at a different stage of transformation, providing a gruesome timeline of the infection's progression. Sarah threw herself into the investigation, desperate to find some way to help Mike and the others who'd been changed. She pored over maps, identifying potential hideouts for the creatures. But with each passing day, hope dwindled. It was on the 5th day that everything changed. Sarah was in the command center when all hell broke loose. Alarms blared as reports flooded in from all sectors of the preserve. The creatures were on the move and they were organized. "They're probing our defenses," the military commander growled, looking for weak points. Sarah's mind raced. This level of coordination wasn't, random. It spoke of intelligence, of planning. And then she remembered Mike's words about the original Skunk Ape, the one that seemed to be in control. "There's a leader," she blurted out, "something bigger, smarter than the others. If we can find it..." Dr. Reyes nodded grimly. "We need to capture it. It might be our best chance at understanding this infection. Maybe even finding a cure." A plan was hastily formed. Using Sarah's knowledge of the swamp, they identified the most likely location for the Skunk Ape's lair, a remote area deep in the heart of the Devil's Garden. A special forces team was assembled, equipped with tranquilizer guns and heavy-duty capture gear. Sarah insisted on going with them. "I know this swamp better than anyone," she argued. "And And if Mike is still in there somewhere, I need to be the one to find him. As they ventured into the infected zone, the swamp seemed to come alive around them. Eyes gleamed from the shadows, and inhuman howls echoed through the trees. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, but Sarah could see the fear in their eyes. They were nearing the suspected lair when all hell broke loose. Creatures burst from the undergrowth, moving with terrifying speed and coordination. The air filled with the thud of tranquilizer darts and the screams of the infected. Sarah found herself separated from the group, pursued by a particularly large beast. She recognized it as the transformed Mike, his eyes gleaming with feral intelligence. She raised her tranquilizer gun, finger on the trigger, but couldn't bring herself to fire. "Mike," she pleaded, "I know you're still in there. Please." For a moment, something flickered in those bestial eyes. Recognition? Remorse? But then it was gone, replaced by primal hunger. Mike lunged. A massive shape barreled into him from the side, sending both creatures tumbling. Sarah gasped as she beheld the original skunk ape in all its terrifying glory. It was even larger than she'd imagined, its muscles rippling beneath matted fur. The skunk ape pinned Mike to the ground with one massive hand. With the other, it reached out towards Sarah. She stumbled backward, raising her gun. But instead of attacking, the creature spoke, its voice a deep rumbling growl.
You come, make it stop.
Sarah's mind reeled. Make what stop? The skunk ape's eyes, disturbingly human, bored into her.
The change, the hunger, too many now, can't control.
Understanding dawned on Sarah. The skunk ape hadn't intended for the infection to spread like this. It was losing control of its transformed kin, and now it wanted help? Before she could respond, a volley of tranquilizer darts struck the skunk ape. It roared in pain and fury, releasing Mike. Sarah had a split second to decide. She fired her own dart into Mike's flank, praying it would be enough to subdue him without causing harm. As the skunk ape stumbled, fighting the sedative's effects, Sarah made a desperate gamble. She approached it slowly, hands raised. "We can help you," she said, "but you have to come with us. We need to understand what's happening." The creature's massive head swiveled towards her. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah thought it would attack. Then slowly, it nodded. As the Special Forces team converged on their location, Sarah stood between them and the semi-conscious skunk ape. "Don't shoot," she shouted. "This might be our only chance to end this." In the chaotic aftermath, as the skunk ape and the sedated Mike were secured for transport, Sarah allowed herself a glimmer of hope. They had captured the source of the infection. Maybe now they could find a way to reverse it to save Mike and all the others who'd been transformed. But as she looked out over the swamp, at the inhuman shape still lurking in the shadows, Sarah knew the nightmare was far from over. The legend of the skunk ape had become all too real, and the world would never be the same. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The CDC established a fortified research facility on the edge of Big Cypress, where Dr. Reyes and her team worked tirelessly to unravel the mysteries of the skunk ape infection. The original creature, now sedated and contained in a specially designed enclosure, became the focal point of their studies. Sarah split her time between assisting the researchers and coordinating ongoing efforts to capture the remaining infected individuals still roaming the swamp. Each successful capture brought a mix of relief and heartache, especially when she recognized former colleagues or missing persons among the transformed. Mike, along with the other early-stage infectees, was kept in a secure medical ward. Sarah visited him daily, watching for any sign of recognition in his feral eyes. Some days she thought she saw a flicker of his old self. Other days he was a stranger wearing Mike's transformed face. It was during one of these visits that Dr. Reyes approached her, excitement evident in her tired eyes. "We've had a breakthrough," she said. "The skunk ape's DNA. It's not entirely terrestrial. There are sequences we've never seen before, almost alien in nature." Sarah's mind reeled. "Are you saying it's some kind of, extraterrestrial?" Dr. Reyes shook her head. "Not exactly. Our working theory is that it's the result of ancient alien genetic experimentation, perhaps even a failed attempt to create a human-animal hybrid. It's been lying dormant in the swamp for centuries, maybe millennia, until something recently triggered its awakening. The implications were staggering. But how does this help us cure the infected? We've isolated the key components of the transformative agent, Dr. Reyes explained, and we think we can create a counter-agent, but she hesitated. We need a human test subject, someone in the early stages of infection. Sarah's gaze drifted to Mike's containment cell. She knew what she had to do. The next day, Sarah stood outside Mike's cell, a syringe filled with the experimental treatment in her hand. Dr. Reyes hovered nearby, monitoring equipment at the ready. "Are you sure about this?" the doctor asked, "and we don't know what side effects it might have." Sarah nodded grimly. "I'm sure Mike risked everything trying to uncover the truth. I owe it to him to take this risk." As they entered the cell, Mike growled, pressing himself against the far wall. Sarah approached slowly, speaking in soothing tones. "It's okay, Mike. I'm here to help. Please, let me help you." Whether it was her voice or some lingering fragment of Mike's humanity, something made him pause. Sarah seized the moment, quickly injecting the counter-agent into his arm. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Mike's body began to convulse. He let out a howl of pain that made Sarah's blood run cold. She watched in horror and fascination as his form seemed to ripple and shift, fur receding, limbs realigning. After what felt like an eternity, the transformation stopped. Where the beast had been, Mike now lay unconscious but recognizably human. Sarah rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. "Mike, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto her face. "Sarah?" he croaked. What happened?" Before she could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Dr. Reyes rushed to a nearby monitor, her face pale. "It's the skunk ape," she said. "It's awake." Security footage showed the creature, fully conscious and enraged, tearing through its enclosure. Armed guards rushed to contain it, but their tranquilizer darts seemed to have little effect. "It's adapted," Dr. Reyes realized. "The sedatives aren't working anymore." Sarah helped Mike to his feet. Despite his weakened state, his ranger training kicked in. "We need to evacuate," he said. "If that thing gets loose..." They didn't need to finish the thought. The implications of the skunk ape escaping into the wider world were too horrifying to contemplate. As they rushed through the facility, chaos erupted around them. The skunk ape's roars echoed through the corridors, punctuated by screams and the sound of tearing metal. They rounded a corner and came face to face with the beast itself. It stood there, massive and terrifying, blocking their path to freedom. But instead of attacking, it fixed its gaze on Mike. A look of what could only be described as recognition passed over its features, and then, to everyone's shock, it spoke. "You changed back. How?"
You changed back. How?
Mike stepped forward, ignoring Sarah's attempt to hold him back. "We found a cure," he said. "We can help you too. All of you." The skunk ape tilted its head, considering. For a moment, hope blossomed in Sarah's chest. Then alarms blared again, and the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air.
No!
The creature roared.
No more cages.
It turned and smashed through the nearest wall, disappearing into the swamp beyond. Sarah and Mike rushed to the breach, watching as the massive shape melted into the darkness. In the days that followed, a massive search was conducted, but the skunk ape seemed to have vanished without a trace. The military wanted to scorch the entire preserve, but cooler heads prevailed. Instead, a permanent research outpost was established, dedicated to studying the skunk ape phenomenon and treating those who had been infected. Mike, fully recovered, stood with Sarah at the edge of the swamp. The weight of everything they'd been through hung heavy between them. "Do you think it's still out there?" Sarah asked. Mike nodded slowly. "I'm sure of it, and I don't think we've seen the last of it. Something tells me this is just the beginning." As if in answer, a distant howl echoed through the trees. Human? Animal? Or something in between? In the heart of Big Cypress, the legend of the skunk ape lived on, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. If you have enjoyed this story, please subscribe and leave a like. Please suggest some ideas for future stories that you would like to hear. Thanks for listening.